Welcome everyone to another episode of the Friday Times. I'm your host Eli Ayoub. April marked 50 years since the Lebanese Civil War, or in our opinion, better known as the Lebanon Wars, started. We've done an episode with myself and Ayman Makarim on the From the Periphery podcast, talking about a bit the past 50 years, reflecting a bit on it. And the Civil War, again, slash Lebanon Wars, have been an ongoing focus of mine. The doctorate that I talk too much about on this podcast is on it, on the post-war, but of course you cannot talk about the post-war without talking about the wars. But I haven't had much opportunity to talk about like the more personal aspect, and specifically the fact that I'm the child of two parents who, would count as the children of the war. They would be like the war generation. They're the ones who grew up during the war. And Justin has a similar story, has a similar trajectory with his father, Claude Salhani, who was a journalist during the war. So yeah, the purpose of this specific episode is to talk about what does it mean in many ways to be the children of war, because I think that's a very specific positionality, as like we've inherited something without directly experiencing it. But ultimately it's going to be I guess, typical The Far East Times episode in which we mix the person and the political. But before we kind of get into it, our exciting announcement is that Justin is basically joining the From the Periphery Media Collective as a more active member now. He's already been kind of a de facto one for a while. If we would just do it more official.
I think in this new capacity, essentially, I'll be taking some of the work that I've been doing for the past, well, years and bringing it to From the Periphery. So trying to do some episodes, interviews, stuff that's a bit more current affairs than maybe some of the stuff that you've seen on the network. So I'm happy to be joining and collaborating with the other members.
Yeah. And so Justin will be primarily doing the From the Periphery podcast, so the sister podcast of this one. And of course, both of them are part of the From the Periphery Media Collective. And as with everything, to get it out of the way, to support this project and to get everything we do as like exclusive content in many cases, as well as an invitation to join our monthly hangout, our upcoming, well, by the time this comes out, actually our current movie club on Lebanese cinema, and a bunch of other things that we're planning to do, including upcoming podcasts and so on. You can support us by going on patreon.com/from the periphery, and by doing so, you get access, as I mentioned, to all of these things, and of course, you'll be supporting us in the process. Okay, let's get into it. You recently shared a piece on your father, on kind of his legacy and his role during the Civil War as a journalist. Can you talk to us a bit about that to get us started, please?
Sure. We published a piece in Al Jazeera on my dad's work, particularly the early stuff that he did in the kind of mid 70s. He was a photographer, photojournalist from 1975 until 1984 when he left the country. So essentially, this piece was just some of the photographs that he had taken in the early days. I think the frame, we were limited to what was on Getty Images, which was like a small part of his archive from from 1975 to I think about 1977 or 78. He was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in 1983, but that photo was unfortunately not in the Getty collective that is available online in other places. I just want to say that honestly, I was a little bit hesitant to participate in this episode, not because of anything else, because I'm always happy to lend whatever sort of efforts I have to FTP. But it was more just because my father passed away just under 3 years ago. It's still a thing I'm dealing with, and then additionally, my father had a really fantastic career, and I want to kind of step outside of his very large shadow at times if I can. But, this is an interesting opportunity to talk about something and the way that you approached it, in the sense of being the children of the people who are, in a way, primary actors, not as fighters, not as politicians, but as people who lived and experienced the war on a day-to-day basis. I found it an interesting time for reflection in a way that we might not get the opportunity to do in a lot of other spaces.
Yeah, for sure. And on that note, I do appreciate you taking the time to talk about this. My parents, I mean, luckily are still with us. They experienced the wars as Red Cross volunteers. My father was at one point, he became fairly high ranked within the Lebanese Red Cross. As such, he witnessed some horrors, including the Sabra and Shatila massacre when they were allowed in towards the end. And this is something that I grew up with, not necessarily as like an active thing. Like the wars were not, it's not something that we talked about a lot. It's just something that was like in the background. There would be like this yearly, for example, get together with a bunch of former Red Cross, or current, but like people who knew one another as Red Cross volunteers during the wars. And I would go there. They would take family and stuff, so we would go, and so that was, almost a get together, right? Like you would see people meeting and sharing memories, laughing over drinks and whatever. It took me a long, long time. This is very much like in retrospective to really comprehend the fact that the thing that they were primarily talking about is the wars, like is violence, is bombing, is witnessing horrors. They've lost people, friends of theirs and whatnot. But I've experienced it as like a secondhand thing in many ways. And there is this concept of post memory by Marianne Hirsch, which is the thing that post-war generation, when they have kids, or rather us basically, who are born either after the war or were too young to remember the war effectively, we might still experience elements of it, but only because or mostly because our parents experienced it as teenagers, as adults, and whatnot before they had us, effectively. And this was the case. My parents were 15 when it started and were 30 when it ended, and I was born when they were 31. There's very much like the end of a chapter in many ways in their lives, and I'm symbolically, if you want, the beginning of a new one in their lives. But it didn't end, right? Like when the new one starts, the previous one didn't finish. It stayed with us in many ways. And one of the things we talked about in that from the brief episode with Ayman and on this podcast as well, this is something that is a recurring theme, is that the post and post-war is something to be questioned. Like to what extent, especially in the case of a quote-unquote civil war like the Lebanese one, at what point did it actually end? 1990 is contested, 2000 is contested, 2005 is contested, and so on and so forth. We won't get into it as much here. This is not the purpose, but just to say that like it wasn't as clear cut of a end, right, for them, and then we are the beginning or anything like that. It's actually much more messy, I guess, for better or worse.
Yeah, I think as well, the civil wars or the series of wars, right? Because it obviously also drew in international and regional actors, and there were a number of people, either funding groups or physically present on Lebanese land during this period, this 1975 to 1990-ish period. Obviously, like as you mentioned and may have talked about in the other podcast, that it carried on in different ways. I think that, for our parents, like you said, your parents were 15. My dad was 23 when the war started. My mother was present from 1982 to 1984 during, she lived through the siege of West Beirut, the expulsion of the PLO, post Sabra and Shatila. She was present for all these different things. And then 84, I think my parents decided they'd had kind of enough. So the war in that sense ended for him. He would have been, I think, 32 when he left. But, he growing up, similar to you, and I wrote this in piece that, or maybe in a post on some sort of social media or other, you know, th these stories, whereas this war, this period, this 9-year period was probably the formative period for him definitely as a journalist, arguably even as a person, the definitive period, moments, events in his life. For my childhood, this was the definitive stories. Like this was the definitive event of my childhood that I didn't live through. I was born in 87, so the war was still ongoing, but born outside and didn't visit Lebanon in that period at all. But the stories of the Civil War stay with me. I think like you, there were laughs. A lot of them were laughs. A lot of them were kind of romanticized, but there were also the serious horrors, the awful things that they had seen. And I think any kind of first aid worker, any kind of person in civil defense, obviously Red Cross, and media, as well as the fighters themselves, are seeing almost everything that there is to see in those sort of instances. Like I said, in my case, there was kind of romanticism about it. I think because, it's the thing that propelled my father, his career forward. It was the thing that made him, the person that he was. Like I mentioned, he was nominated for a Pulitzer, but he was also on covers of multiple newspapers and magazines around the world, right? And all these things were incredibly formative for his career, for his life, for everything that came later. So there's a fondness for maybe who he was able to be in an otherwise very horrible period. But there's also, the other legacies of that, the fact that he left and he never went really back to live in Lebanon again, apart from a very short period in the mid-aughts, or the mid-2010s rather. And so I think that, I imagine it might be the same for you, is that for us, this was a formative period of learning about the horrors of the country in a way that maybe isn't taught and obviously isn't taught in textbooks, isn't taught in Lebanese schools, and isn't kind of passed around. I'll add one last thing, which is that, being a journalist or being, I think, an aid worker or civil defense, it's not to say you're immune from the sort of intercommunal sort of news or network way of receiving information and perspectives, but I think that you are exposed to maybe a little bit more. So you're able to see, for example, you mentioned your parents were in Sabra and Shatila, or your father at least was. My father had a broken ankle at the time because the Israelis had bombed a building or near his office, and so he had broken his ankle through because of the impact. But he was on scene at Tel Zatar and was on scene at Karantina, two other of,
Hmm.
the major massacres. So this is just to say that they had certain view that maybe the common person, other than the people who were the victims or the perpetrators of those crimes, were not able to see. And yeah, and I think until today we're living with what those events, with the aftermath of those events.
And if I'm not mistaken, the photo that we're using is the one you mentioned, right? After the Israeli bombing. There's two people carrying him because he's injured.
Yeah, that's him in the middle, and my mother is on, I think, the right side.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if I've already told you this, but I had seen some of the photos before as part of just the doctorate. So I know for a fact that there's a photo for those people listening. We will include the link in the show note, of course, but it's like halfway through the link is Palestinian nationalist fighters called Fedayeen, and he's talking about there's a photo of one of them with like a gun aiming at something at the PFLP camp in 1975. And as you mentioned, there's a few photos from the Quarantina one, which was one of the first major one, definitely one of the first major ones. It was in 76 in terms of big massacres. That I guess it's fair to say kind of defined a lot of how things would happen after that, in the sense that you would have like these massive bouts of violence, in this case, like a literal massacre. And then in the months that followed, sometimes in the days, weeks, and often sometimes in the months that followed, you'd have a progressive emptying out of that camp, i.e., like there would be ethnically cleansed from the camp or from the area where they're being besieged and whatever, which was the case with Karantina. And the photos that he took are of, a woman with her three kids, and there's a fighter behind them from the Kataib, clearly phalangist, overseeing their expulsion, basically. As much as I can try and take some distance from it, which is not easy for me, of course, to do, it's powerfully shot, right? Like the frames, the way the scenes that he's taking, if that makes sense. I'm very bad at describing art or the art form in general, including photographs. They just say so much to the point that I can lose myself a bit in individual frames, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's obviously photography has changed a lot, has evolved a lot. The ability to take a photograph has become way more democratized and accessible. But I think a lot of what it was at the time was just being on scene. For example, in that particular instance, my dad told me that Michel Smeha, who at the time was, well, at first was a student leader with the Kataib, the Phalangist, and then later on went on to become kind of a military leader, or at least somebody in the organization of prominence. He called my father and told him something was happening in Karantina. So my father went down there and got a number of shots and then was threatened when he left by the Kataib, basically told to give his film, and he refused. And they said, if you publish anything, you'll be in trouble. And that's exactly what happened. He published, asked to withhold his name. His name was included, and then he couldn't go to East Beirut for at least a couple of years. So essentially, part of what he was doing here was just being on scene and being witness. And I think in Karantina, like I asked him why Michel Smeha would have called him and told him to go look at what's happening. And he told me he wasn't sure. We really didn't know at the time, like why somebody would want to advertise this sort of thing. Who knows if it was they thought they were proud or if there was something else at play. Of course, like you said, this was an ethnic cleansing operation. At the time, there was a number of poor people of different sects and different kind of ethnicities, because you had a number of Armenians, there were Palestinians, there were Shia, there were different groups. A lot of them were pushed out so that there could be kind of a Christian pathway from East Beirut up the coast. And then Tel Zatar as well was a Palestinian camp, which today is not there anymore. These wider efforts, and these were the things that were captured and the things that our parents lived through. And so they know the city, today the city that we see and the city that I think, well, it's changed undoubtedly since you and I have been alive and have been in and out of here. And I think if you came back today, you'd notice some things have changed and beginning to change as well. That's also something to keep in mind when we go further and further back, that the makeup in terms of where you think you're going, where you're comfortable going, who is from where and who's coming from where are continuing to change. I wanted to add one thing to the idea of the stories that we grew up with, because I think it's kind of an important point, and this kind of idea of romanticization. And I think this is maybe something we can talk about a little bit here, which is, um, grow, our first ideas of the Civil War before or civil wars before we get into books and reading and personal study, right? Documentary, film, whatever. It usually comes from stories from our families, and I think that's universally true, right? And so, I'm asked a lot if because I think the Lebanese wars are romanticized a little bit. It was a place where, there was this idea of Palestinian resistance, and on one quarter, on the other side, there's the idea of Lebanese resistance, or what essentially the phalangists call kind of the Lebanese resistance until today. Out of that also came from different sides came the resistance, the resistance to Israel, later on an Islamic resistance, and there were these different forms of things and ideas and concepts that come out of this. And so the general thing is really romanticized. So why do people who have maybe a clear-eyed view, or at least a certain perspective on this period, still tell stories and laugh, still tell stories and joke, still tell stories about bravery? And I think it's because this is, for me at least, this living through such things. And I haven't lived through something as complex as the Lebanese Civil War, but I was here present during this last iteration of war, especially the intensification from September to November. And I think the thing is that while there is there's a shadow that hangs over that period, right? It is a heavy period. It is a dark period, and that is the four happening. You still do have moments of human life happening on a day to day, because you still have to live your life. You still have to wake up. In a lot of people's cases, you still have to go to work. There are a number of people who are going to work throughout the Civil War, and not just as first aid workers or civil defense or journalists or whatever. You had people working at banks. You had people trying to teach schools when the schools were open. You had people doing a number of interesting or mundane or whatever kind of jobs, right? And so I think that, passing down these stories is also it's in a sense it's a highlight reel. It's passing down the highlights from those times, the things that they can remember most. But it's also just the human condition to try to encapsulate all the different parts of the human condition into, a period that they had lived through where there was that complexity, but to still be alive, to still tell jokes, to still, find humor in otherwise dark circumstances.
Absolutely. And there's a really good film called Phantom Beirut by Ghassan Salhab, which came out in the early 90s, or mid 90s or something. And it's one of those films that you can see like was created in the immediate aftermath. I was filmed in the immediate aftermath of the wars, of the end of the official end, let's say 1990. And there is a scene that I always have in mind. It's a really powerful one. So one of the actors, she talks to the camera, and where she basically says something along the lines of, like, at least during the war, I knew who I was, and now who am I? Right? Like during there was this sense, and this is talked about in multiple medium, whether it's movies, books, or whatever, of looking forward to the end of the war. So you were like, when the war ends, I'm gonna learn the piano. When the war ends, I'm gonna become an architect. When the war, etc. So you have something to look forward to. And then the way it ended, because it ended in a pretty unspectacular way, it was just like a signing of a thing, and then it progressively died out. And not even entirely, obviously, and especially southern Lebanon, you still had it until 2000, and then 2006 happened anyway, etc., etc. That the fact that the separation, the way I understood it is that because the so-called post-war wasn't entirely peaceful, in any way, shape, or form. There was at some point this sense in, I think, people, how they remembered it, that at the very least in that period between 75 and 1990, we knew that there was a war. Like there was a name to it. Like there was this, and as we know, it's multiple wars. But we knew there was 82. We knew there was the siege, and then the occupation. You didn't have to ask too many questions as to, like, why are we in the situation that we're currently in that sense. At the very least, that's kind of one of the experiences. And I've certainly felt this in not necessarily just my parents, but in general, seeing a lot of the production of people who, were roughly the age I'm at, or maybe younger now, during that period of the 70s and 80s, and how they experienced it in some sense may not be that different than how I experienced the post-war, And of course, in other ways, it would be very, very different than how I experienced the post-war. But then even then depends when and where. If you're in Dahi in 2006, then you might have the same experience as someone who was in Beirut in 2000 and sorry, in 1982, for example. But nothing before and nothing after, right? Like there would be like this almost this window of into what someone else experienced like decades before you were born even. So there is all of these things happening at the same time. That's why for me, specifically for the purpose of this conversation, trying to understand what they went through other than just talking to them, which of course I've done, is interesting for me to also keep in perspective, to also understand my own relationship with Lebanon today. There is something to be said about how, again, as I put it in the title, like they were the children of the war. Many of them, of course, were older than others, but for the most part, they were like teenagers, early 20s. We're talking about like our parents' generation when it started. And so, in the case of mine, it's almost like a clear cut, like 15 teenage years almost start, whatever, and then 30 and 31 parents. It's like, then
Yeah.
where was the childhood? What was your formative, what were your formative years other than the civil wars? And that's when you have these stories because they have best friends from those times that are still their best friends today. And so
Yeah.
clearly other things happened than quote unquote just the war in that period.
And who are you after the war? Who are
Exactly.
you now that you're an adult in a period where there's not this sort of daily survival anymore? Um, it's interesting because I'll speak to a lot of photographers from my dad's era, and they'll tell, some of them will say to me things that you might be kind of shocked at because they've seen some of the most horrible things, but I've heard more than once, and won't name specific names here, but they'll be like, the war was a great time because all I would do is take my camera, go down. There was always work. Now, unless there's tragedy, and that is that is a kind of pitfall of working in this kind of media is that
Mm,
when horrible things happen, you've got a stream of work, and when it's common mundane daily life, you've got to figure out how to survive. You've got to get creative in ways to tell stories or to stay employed even.
mhm,
So I mean, part of that is understandable. I mean, I think like you said, the thing about the war is after the war, I'll learn the piano or anything. I think there's also simple things like after the war, the bar will be open, the nightclub will be open. After the war, it won't be dangerous for me to go visit my friend. After the war, I won't have to listen to this drone above my head. And it's like, I think that there's maybe this isn't a perfect um, comparison, but like, I think sometimes people have a similar idea about migration, that like,
mm,
oh, if I could just be in a country that has stability, everything would be perfect without realizing that sometimes having everything that you feel has been stopping you out of the way uh, does not necessarily equal, liberation. You're still dealing with like you're still carrying that baggage into the
mhm,
future, right? You're still having to live through and process everything that you've gone through. And oftentimes, especially when you're in the case of our parents who have maybe lost, in my dad's case, 9 years, but in your parents' case, 15. And of course, within that, they've got these internal lives that they're building, meeting loved ones, having children, um, sometimes there's this feeling of khalas, like we don't want to reflect, we don't want to face, we don't
yeah,
want to deal with the past, we want to move forward. I think one thing you see a lot about with the Lebanese is this kind of joie de vivre, this idea of like we want to enjoy the moment because we don't know if the next one is going to be here. And honestly, I find myself thinking about this quite often. I've
mm,
recently kind of relocated to Beirut to a certain level. I've been kind of in and out, but like recently got an apartment. My partner showed up, or came more permanently a little over a month ago, found an apartment, which I'm recording from now. And part of me is always thinking, how long until the next big thing? We're only,
mhm,
5 months out of the last signed ceasefire. The Israelis are still attacking around the country. They still hit Beirut just a few weeks ago,
mhm,
Dahya. We are just a couple, we're coming up on 5 years of the Beirut port explosion, which might be a once in a lifetime event, but how many once in a lifetime events have we lived through here? We're
exactly.
6 years out of the economic collapse, the banking crisis. We're 10 years out from the You Stink movement. We're 35, 50 years out from the Civil War, but we've had a number, like you said, a number of many incidents here and there. Now, there is a level of optimism in the country in some ways and in some quarters that there may not have been before. Um, but the other side of that is like, that was similar in 2010. There was a similar kind of feeling in 2009, 2010, of course. not universal, but in some quarters, this idea that the economy is going in a certain direction, people are moving back. So part of me is trying to take it in, and I think about something. Um, our friend and has also been on this podcast before, Lena Monzer, has told me that, she used to walk around the streets and try to remember the different details of, the different balconies and the different street corners and the different shops and the different people walking by because um, part of me knows that there's always the likelihood of me being here, and this, of course, this is a privilege, but the likelihood of me being here in 10 years and 20 years um, is not guaranteed, you know. The like I guess the best way to put it is that like there are no guarantees here, and I think there is a non-remote possibility that there's a time somewhere in the near or mid or distant future where I find myself reminiscing about Beirut the way that my parents did, or the way that my dad did in particular. For the rest of his life, he dreamed of coming back in one way or another, and it never really worked out for him for a number of reasons. Maybe the place changed, maybe he did. There were times where it wasn't safe. There was time where it wasn't safe to bring a family. And so in the back of my mind, there's a non-remote possibility that there might be a time or a series of conditions sometime in the future where Beirut will not be an option for me, not even to visit, not even to, how many people around the region are in exile? And some of those are in self-imposed exile, and some of those are in an exile where there's no, it might be a nostalgic exile, but there are, a number of people who are in genuine exile. They cannot return to a country because of a certain regime or a certain reality on the ground. Um, and so, it's difficult when, like you said, to get through the war, you have a thing of something will happen after the war. But I think at the same time, that moment, and I think this is something you were alluding to, that moment also never really arrived. Not because the wars maybe never ended, the war is ongoing, or the reality has not changed, but there's a real possibility that there's no happy ending here. There's a real possibility, my father passed away, he never came back. That story was left open, right? And so there's a realization, yeah, our parents were young when the war started and it ended when they were relatively still in their kind of, adulthood, youth. What about the people who were in their mid 60s when the war happened? Or what about the people who were towards the end of their life? And so you're your life is ending, and we know that there are daily tragedies every day, but this kind of narrative of something really has the opportunity to go on, and it will carry on beyond us and past us.
Absolutely, and thanks for those reflections. Well, Justin, a way of coming down to slowly wrapping up. I think a lot about a woman who is featured in one of the documentaries that I studied. Her name is Mariam. She talks a lot about how the post-war, like the Lebanon, basically is a lie. Is how she described it, because there is no room for her or her missing son. 1982, right? Like, so now it's 40 years since and plus. And at the time already, it was almost 30 when that film came out. And the way she would remember him is by painting him, because obviously 1982 when he was 16, meaning they didn't have that many photos. So the way to remember him and whatnot. And I think a lot about her because she represents specifically this amount of people in Lebanon, and there's a lot of them, who have relatives who were forcibly disappeared, who have relatives who left forever, have relatives who, of course, died, and have relatives who left, came back, left, came back. Lots of different, not really to think about it in a hierarchy of suffering because it's difficult to do that, but different experiences, mostly negative, at least the ones I'm thinking of here. And the way the post-war, quote unquote, usually dealt with them is through this, like, just move on, just like look to the future. And on the one hand, there was this understandable need of many, like I would imagine my parents, 15 to 30, as I said, suddenly they turn 30, it's finally over as far as their personal experience went. I wouldn't blame anyone. I can barely imagine it. So I cannot blame them for saying I don't want to think about the past 15 years anymore. I want to move on. Um, at the same time, there were many who did not even have that option. It did not end in 1990 period, because again, either they were in South Lebanon or because they have relatives who forcibly disappeared and so on and so forth. And I thought about her again when the Assad regime fell, because as part of that collapse, we saw people being released from those prisons, and there were a number of Lebanese and Palestinians who were publicly declared to be dead by the Syrian regime, obviously, and by the Lebanese state as well. And so their family had inherited stuff. If there was, they went through the entire bureaucratic process, treated as if they were no longer with us. In any case, um, I wanted to have this conversation, and we'll kind of, as I say, wrap it. I'll let you have the final thoughts if you want. We'll end on that. It's a way I wanted to have at the very least this added dimension, because so the episode I did with Ayman was, analytical. We didn't mention some personal stuff, but for the most part was like analytical, talking, just explaining the situation as two people who have studied it in our different capacities. But there is that deeper, in my opinion, like an element that is not talked about as much, at least often enough. And that's partly because it's much messier. It's, more liquid, you might say. It's less, um, yeah, it's less concrete in many ways because, as I've mentioned, I did not experience this thing myself. I didn't even experience the occupation of South Lebanon because I was not in South Lebanon. So my experience was of the post-war, in comparison to most people, relatively privileged, I would say. But even within that, it didn't stop me from being not far from a car bomb, the one that killed Shwan Twaini. I was like four cars behind them, three, 4 cars behind that, and of seeing 2006 war from where I lived, but because Lebanon is hilly, just seeing Beirut in front of me, just seeing the jets, and having this just bizarre experience of just not fully comprehending the severity of it until after it was over. So I imagine, well, what if it was that, but over a longer period of 15 years? Like when even is the end, right? And of course, as we said, there wasn't really one.
Right. And I think you're right that there was no end because the effects of it are ongoing till today, right? And which is
Yeah.
essentially a lack of justice, a lack of reparations, a lack of dealing with what happened and trying to set over the sort of conditions that would prevent anything like that from happening again. Not just the intersectarian fighting, but the lack of justice, the lack of answers. And I mean, that's the thing about living in Lebanon and to an extent Syria and other places in the region is that there are ghosts among us. There are these ghosts who are, the disappeared, the people who were killed during the war, the people who were killed for, in much more maybe like quote unquote mundane circumstances. If you die in a car accident during the war, like that's still a casualty that didn't have to happen otherwise. And I'll go one step further and say like, um, there are ghosts of ourselves. They're the ghosts of all the possibilities that we could have been. And I think our parents, notice that in particular is what kind of person could you have be if there was a stable society. And, till today we have friends, I know you and I both have friends, Elia, that are leaving the country because of, I mean, one, repeated conflict, but two, okay, what are the possibilities for my children here? Is, in a place that is not stable, in a place that doesn't have a level of, um, you know, let's say, time to build its society and flesh itself out with a kind of diversity that is conducive to well-formed human beings. It's not to say good people are not raised here; they absolutely are, but they may not have the same opportunities. And this summer, I was actually visiting a cousin of mine on my father's side who was born in Beirut, and then his family left right away. He was actually born in 75 and left, I think almost instantly. Actually his family was living in the Arab Gulf at the time, and I think it was just they came back to so he was born and then they left again. And he spent he after that he never lived in Lebanon. And he's born in 75, so he's a bit older than me. So I was visiting him in San Francisco where he lives, and we were just chatting because he has two, young children, and they were playing. And so, he said to me, sometimes I think about what if we had grown up in Beirut together? He grew up mostly in Paris and then in California, and I was in Washington, D.C. And we've been lucky to have a relationship still, but he turned in that kind of, I would step back a bit because that is the ghost of, and this is a very, minute example, but the fact that a cousin and I could have had a closer relationship, could have geographically been closer and lived next to each other and had that feeling of community and family, ripped apart. And that's for us, who were in the diaspora. And that's also for the people inside who had family flee, that had, cousins grow up in Australia or in France or in the Gulf or in Africa or wherever else. So this is absolutely connected to the fact that, the war is not over because these people continue, these specters continue to live among us. Those stories from our parents um, illustrate that more than anything else, in terms of the people they were, the people that they could have been, as well as the possibilities that we could have. And that carries on. We are the children of war, and the children of our children or our children will also, have this sort of baggage and have the repercussions of this one way or another.
And there are people now who, you would one day describe them as the children of war as well, if they've experienced, if they were in Dahi or in southern Lebanon or what have you. And even if they weren't this city, but you know what I mean? That there was that thing that also happened, for a good chunk of their life already. Not to mention 2006, the 1 month long war, which was very intense, of course, as well, and so on and so forth. You have these different things that now kind of already have defined parts of our childhood, even those of us who did not experience, the 75 to 1990 phase of it all. Because it never really ended, then there is also this continuity, and in that continuity, there is a lot of trauma, a lot of ghosts, a lot of hauntings, and also a lot of possibility of trying to talk to the people and trying to actually understand their experiences, which is what I've tried to do, for example, with the story of Mariam. And these people are all around us. Lebanon is quite literally filled with these stories, and there is an unending number of them, and there is something there to be done. And of course, many people are doing that. But I hope at the very least, this conversation, is a short contribution to that, to that end. And yeah, on that note, Justin, as always, thank you for being here. And if people want to follow your work, where can they go?
On all the social media that I take part in, I'm at Justin Salhani, JustinSalhani.
Thanks again, Justin.
Thanks, Elia.